Everyone remembered the man on the cross. Everyone remembered the crown of thorns. Everyone remembered the nails, the blood, the last words spoken from a hill outside Jerusalem. But almost nobody remembers the man who walked behind him. The man who lifted the wood when Jesus could no longer lift it himself. The man whose shoulders touched the same beam that would soon carry the weight of the world's most famous death. His name was Simon, Simon of Cyrene. And for 2,000 years, his story has been sitting quietly in the corners of the Gospels, waiting for someone to notice. Think about that for a moment. The most painted scene in human history, the most sculpted moment in Western art, the most recited passage in Christian worship. And right there in the middle of it is a man whose name is mentioned only 3 times in the entire Bible, 3 short sentences. That's all we have. And yet without him, the story we all know might have looked very different. So tonight, I want to take you on a walk down a dusty road in Jerusalem almost 2,000 years ago. I want to introduce you to a man who was pulled out of a crowd, forced to carry a cross that wasn't his, and then vanished from the pages of history like smoke from a small fire. But before he vanished, he touched something eternal. And the question I want us to sit with tonight is this: why did the world remember the one who died, but forget the one who helped him get there? Let me tell you something first, before we go any deeper. History has a strange habit. It loves the loud. It loves the kings, the generals, the prophets who stood on hilltops and shouted. But history has always been quietly built by the ones who stayed silent, the ones who carried water for soldiers, the ones who cooked bread for prophets, the ones who lifted a cross when a tired man fell in the dirt. These people rarely get statues. They rarely get holidays, but their fingerprints are all over the story. Simon of Cyrene is one of those people. Now, I want you to picture something with me. Close your eyes for just a second if you can. Imagine a city packed with people, Jerusalem during Passover, one of the busiest times of the year. The streets are narrow. The air smells like dust, sweat, animals, spices, and smoke from cooking fires. Thousands of pilgrims have poured into the city from every corner of the Roman Empire. Jews from Egypt, Jews from Greece, Jews from North Africa, Jews from Mesopotamia. They've come to celebrate the festival of freedom, remembering how their ancestors escaped slavery in Egypt. And in the middle of that celebration, a man is being led to his death. Roman soldiers push through the crowd. Their armor clinks. Their voices are sharp. They carry whips and spears. Between them stumbles a bloodied man carrying a heavy wooden beam across his shoulders. He has been beaten through the night. His back is torn open. His face is swollen. He has not slept. He has not eaten. He has been dragged from one trial to another, from Caiaphas to Pilate, from Pilate to Herod, from Herod back to Pilate again. And now, finally, he is walking the last road he will ever walk. The beam he carries is not the full cross like the paintings show. It's the cross beam, the patibulum, as the Romans called it. A thick piece of wood, probably weighing somewhere between 70 and 100 pounds. It would be tied across his shoulders and arms. The vertical post was already waiting at the execution site, planted in the ground like a tree. And somewhere along that road, Jesus falls. The Gospels don't describe the fall in detail. They don't have to. Anyone in the ancient world who had ever seen a crucifixion procession knew what happened when a condemned man collapsed. The soldiers didn't wait. They didn't offer water. They didn't call a doctor. They simply grabbed the nearest strong-looking man in the crowd and forced him to carry the wood. And that man was Simon. The Gospel Mark tells us this. And Mark is usually considered the oldest of the 4 Gospels, written maybe 30 or 40 years after the events. Mark writes, and I'm paraphrasing here in plain English, that the soldiers forced a passerby to carry the cross, a man coming in from the countryside, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now stop right there, because that little detail, that tiny mention, is one of the most fascinating clues in the entire New Testament. Why does Mark bother to name Simon's sons? Think about it. Mark doesn't usually name random people. He doesn't tell us the names of most of the disciples' fathers. He doesn't tell us the names of the soldiers. He doesn't tell us the names of the women in the crowd, but he stops right in the middle of the most important scene in his entire book, and he says, Simon, father of Alexander and Rufus, Scholars have argued about this for centuries, and the most common explanation is beautifully simple. Mark wrote this because the people reading his gospel knew Alexander and Rufus personally. They were members of the early Christian community, maybe in Rome, maybe somewhere else, but they were real people, living, breathing, walking around, telling their neighbors, "Our father carried the cross of Jesus." That means Simon didn't just carry the wood and disappear. Simon went home. Simon told the story. Simon raised sons who became part of the movement that would eventually change the world. And yet, we forgot him. Let me tell you a little about where Simon came from. Cyrene was not some small village next door to Jerusalem. Cyrene was a city on the coast of North Africa, in what today we call Libya. It was a Greek-speaking city founded centuries earlier by settlers from the Greek island of Thera. By the time of Jesus, Cyrene was part of the Roman Empire, and it had a large Jewish population. Some historians estimate that Jews made up as much as a quarter of the city's population. So Simon was a Jew, but he was a Jew from Africa. He had traveled hundreds of miles across the Mediterranean to be in Jerusalem for Passover. He had probably saved for this trip for years, maybe his whole life. Maybe he brought his sons with him, teaching them the traditions of their people. Maybe he was standing there in the crowd, thinking about the lamb he had just sacrificed at the temple, thinking about the meal he would eat that evening with his family, thinking about the ancient story of Moses and Pharaoh and the parting of the Red Sea. And then the soldiers grabbed him. Can you imagine that? One moment you are a tourist, a pilgrim, a father, a farmer coming into the city from a rented room in the countryside. The next moment, a Roman soldier's hand is on your shoulder, and you are being forced to carry the instrument of another man's execution. There is a word the Romans used for this, angeria. It was a legal term. It meant compulsory service. The Romans had the right to grab any non-citizen and force him to do labor for the state, carry a message, carry a soldier's pack, carry a beam of wood up a hill to a place called Golgotha. Simon had no choice. If he refused, he could be killed on the spot. If he ran, he could be hunted down. If he protested, he could be whipped. So he did what any father, any husband, any traveler far from home would do. He bent down, he lifted the wood, and he walked. Now here is where I want us to slow down, because I think this is the part of the story that gets lost in all the paintings and all the sermons. What was Simon feeling? What was going through his mind? We don't know. We can't know. The Gospels don't tell us, and this is important because I promised you at the beginning of this story that I would not invent things. I would not put words in Simon's mouth. I would not pretend to read his thoughts. But I can tell you this. I can tell you what any human being would probably feel in that moment. Fear, anger, confusion, resentment, maybe even shame. Because in the Roman world, carrying a cross was not a symbol of holiness. It was a symbol of humiliation. It was the mark of a criminal. It was the walk of the condemned. Simon was not condemned, but he was walking the walk of the condemned. And the crowd around him would have seen him and pointed and whispered. Some might have thought he was a fellow criminal. Some might have thought he was a slave. Some might have felt sorry for him. Some might have laughed. And Jesus was walking in front of him, maybe stumbling, maybe silent, maybe looking back over his shoulder at the man who was now carrying his burden. The Gospels don't describe any conversation between them. No exchange of words, no dramatic eye contact, no whispered thank you, just two men, one condemned, one conscripted, walking the same road toward the same hill. And yet I believe something happened on that road. I believe it because of what came after. Remember what Mark told us. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And these names show up again quietly in the letters of Paul. In Paul's letter to the Romans, written to the Christian community in Rome, Paul sends greetings to a long list of people. And near the end of that list he writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me also." Now Rufus was not a rare name in the Roman world, so we can't be 100% certain this is the same Rufus, but many scholars, going all the way back to the early church fathers, believed that it was. They believed that this was the son of Simon of Cyrene. And if that is true, then Simon's family became part of the very heart of the early Christian church. Simon's wife became like a mother to the Apostle Paul. Simon's son became a leader in the community. Simon's household became a place where the message of Jesus was preserved and passed on. That is not the story of a man who carried a cross and walked away angry. That is the story of a man who was changed. That is the story of a family that was transformed. That is the story of an ordinary encounter that became something eternal. But here is where the tension comes in. Here is where we have to be honest. The Bible does not tell us that Simon became a follower of Jesus that day. The Bible does not say that he fell to his knees and wept. The Bible does not say that he ran home and told his family that he had met the Son of God. We are filling in gaps here. We are reading between the lines. What we know for sure is only this: Simon carried the cross. Simon had two sons named Alexander and Rufus. These names were remembered by the early church. Everything else is inference, and I want to be honest about that, because history is not a novel. History is a puzzle with missing pieces, and the honest historian, the honest storyteller, has to admit when the pieces are missing. But that is what makes this story so powerful. Not what we know, but what we don't know. We don't know if Simon and Jesus ever spoke. We don't know if Simon watched the crucifixion. We don't know if Simon stayed in Jerusalem or went back home to Africa. We don't know if he lived a long life or died young. We don't know if he was buried in a marked grave or an unmarked one. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know how he sounded. We don't know if he ever forgave the Romans for what they made him do. And yet, despite all of these unknowns, his name has survived for 2,000 years. Think about that. Simon of Cyrene has outlived Caesars. He has outlived empires. He has outlived cathedrals and kingdoms and revolutions. His name is still spoken today in every corner of the world by people who have never seen his face, who have never been to his hometown, who will never know his voice. Why does his name survive? The answer, I think, is deeper than history. The answer is deeper than religion. The answer touches something at the very core of what it means to be human. We remember Simon because Simon reminds us of ourselves. Let me explain what I mean. Most of us will never be Jesus. We will never be the hero of a great story. We will never have paintings made of our sacrifice. We will never have holidays named after our death. We will never be the one who changes the world with a single act of love. Most of us will be Simon. Most of us will be pulled into stories we did not choose. Most of us will be given burdens we did not ask for. Most of us will find ourselves walking beside someone who is suffering, and we will have to make a choice. Do we help? Do we walk beside them? Do we lift the wood? Simon did not choose to carry the cross. The Romans chose for him. But once the cross was on his shoulders, he had a choice. He could carry it well, or he could carry it poorly. He could carry it with resentment, or he could carry it with dignity. He could see the man in front of him as a criminal, or he could see him as a human being. We don't know exactly what Simon chose, but we know his family ended up in the Christian community. We know his sons became known to the church, and that suggests, at the very least, that something in that walk changed him. Now let me take you back for a moment, because I want to zoom out. I want to place Simon in a bigger picture. The ancient world was a brutal place. Crucifixion was not rare. The Romans crucified thousands upon thousands of people: slaves, rebels, bandits, political enemies. The Roman general Crassus, about 70 years before Jesus was born, crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way after crushing the rebellion of Spartacus. 6,000 crosses, lining a road for miles. That is the world Simon lived in. When a man was crucified, he was not just being executed. He was being erased. Crucifixion was designed to destroy not just the body but the memory. The Romans wanted people to see the crucified and think, that man was nothing. That man was a failure. That man was defeated, and yet, 2,000 years later, the cross is the most recognized symbol on earth. That is a strange twist of history, isn't it? The Romans wanted to erase Jesus. They used their most humiliating punishment. They made sure he died in public, in shame, on a hill outside the city. And it backfired. It became the most famous death in human history. And in the middle of that famous death there was Simon, an ordinary man, a father, a pilgrim, a passerby. Someone the Romans considered so unimportant that they could grab him off the street and use him like a pack animal. But the ordinary man's name survived. and the emperor who ordered the crucifixion. Do you remember his name? Some of you might. It was Tiberius, but most people don't. Most people remember Simon before they remember Tiberius, and Simon was nobody. Simon was just a man in the crowd. That is one of the strangest lessons of history. The powerful spend their whole lives trying to be remembered. They build monuments, they carve their names into stone, they conquer nations, they write laws, they demand worship, and most of them are forgotten within a few generations. Meanwhile, a father from North Africa walking through Jerusalem on his way to a Passover meal gets pulled out of a crowd for maybe half an hour, and his name lasts forever. There is an old saying. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but you hear it in many cultures. The loudest voice is not always the one that echoes the longest. Simon's voice was silent. We don't have a single word, he said, and yet his silence echoes across 2,000 years. Let me tell you now about a piece of this story that most people miss. After Mark's gospel was written, the other gospels also wrote about Simon. Matthew mentions him. Luke mentions him. But there is something interesting. Matthew and Luke, who copied a lot from Mark, dropped the names of Alexander and Rufus. They just say Simon of Cyrene, sons, no family. Why did they drop the names? Scholars have debated this. Some say Matthew and Luke were writing for different audiences who didn't know Alexander and Rufus personally. Some say the sons had already passed away by the time the later Gospels were written. Some say the writers just simplified the story. But the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, does something even stranger. John doesn't mention Simon at all. John's Gospel and says that Jesus carried his own cross. No mention of any help, no mention of any passerby, no Simon. And this is one of those places where historians and theologians have argued for centuries. Did Simon actually carry the cross? Or is it a detail added by Mark? Did John leave Simon out on purpose? Because John was making a theological point that Jesus carried his own burden alone. We don't know for sure. We probably never will. That is the honest answer. History is like an old photograph. The edges are faded. Some faces are clear. Some are blurred. Some are missing altogether. But the three Gospels that do mention Simon are the earliest, and the detail is so specific, so odd, so unnecessary if it were made up, that most historians, even secular historians who don't accept the religious claims of Christianity, tend to think Simon of Cyrene was a real man who really was pulled out of that crowd on that day. Why would you invent a random North African father with two named sons? It doesn't add to the theology. It doesn't advance the drama. It just sits there, quietly, like a real memory. Now, let's talk for a moment about what happened after. We don't have direct records of Simon's later life. No diary. No letters. No tombstone that we can point to. But we do have some interesting clues, and we have to be careful about how we treat them. There are early Christian traditions from the 2nd and 3rd centuries that claim Simon eventually became a Christian himself. Some traditions say he became a bishop. Some say he was martyred for his faith, but these traditions come long after his lifetime. They are the kind of stories that grow up around famous names, and while they may contain grains of truth, we cannot verify them. There is also a strange twist involving one of the early Christian heresies, a group called the Basilidians. Followers of a teacher named Basilides in the 2nd century claimed something shocking. They claimed that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. Thus, they claimed that Simon of Cyrene was crucified in his place, that at the last moment, a kind of miraculous switch happened, and Simon took Jesus' place on the cross. This idea is rejected by mainstream Christianity. It is not supported by any of the Gospels. It is not supported by any credible historical evidence. And I mention it not because it is true, but because it shows how much Simon captured the imagination of the ancient world. Even the heretics were talking about him. Even the outsiders were arguing about him. Interestingly, there is a very similar idea in one of the verses of the Quran. The Quran, written 6 centuries after Jesus, suggests that Jesus was not actually crucified, but that it was made to appear so, and that another man was crucified in his place. Some Islamic commentators have connected this to the Simon story, though the Quran itself does not name Simon. Again, we are drifting into deep waters here, and I want to be honest. These are theological debates that have been argued about for centuries. I am not here to settle them. I am here to tell you about a man named Simon and the ripples his short walk created. But here is what I want you to notice. The story of Simon has traveled far beyond the small circle of the Christian church. His name is remembered in Islam. His name is remembered in Judaism. His name is remembered in African Christianity, where he is celebrated as one of the first Africans to touch the story of Jesus. In fact, if you go to churches across Africa today, from Ethiopia to Nigeria to South Africa, you will often find Simon of Cyrene held up as a special figure. Because Simon reminds African Christians that the story of Jesus was not just a European story or a Middle Eastern story. It was a story that included Africa from the very first day. A black man, or at least an African man, was there at the moment when the cross was being carried. Simon of Cyrene is proof for many African believers that they were never outsiders to this faith. They were there from the beginning. Now, was Simon a black African? Historians actually debate this. Cyrene was a Greek colony. So many of its residents were of Greek or mixed descent. But it was also in North Africa, and there would have been indigenous Berber people, Egyptian people, sub-Saharan people, and Jewish people all mixing in that region. Simon could have been ethnically African. He could have been ethnically Middle Eastern. He could have been ethnically Greek. We simply do not know. What we know is that he came from Africa. And that alone was significant. It means the very first person, outside of Jesus himself, to touch the wood of the cross came from a continent that would later be told, over and over again through history, that it was on the margins of the story. Simon puts that lie to rest. And I want to pause here, because this is the kind of moment where history and meaning intersect. History gives us the facts. Meaning gives us the significance. The fact is that a man from Cyrene carried a cross in Jerusalem. The meaning is that human beings, no matter where they come from, no matter what continent, no matter what language, can find themselves at the center of a story much larger than themselves. Let me tell you a small story from a completely different corner of the world just to make this point. During the Great Depression in the United States, there were countless ordinary people who did extraordinary things without ever being famous. There were farmers who fed strangers, who wandered off the trains. There were widows who took in orphans. There were black porters and white sharecroppers who shared bread when there was almost none to share. Their names never made it into history books. We don't know most of them. But their fingerprints are all over the survival of a nation. Simon is like them. Simon is one of those anonymous helpers of history who happened to get named. And maybe that is the real message his story carries. That greatness does not require fame. That impact does not require applause. That touching to eternity does not require a title. Now let me take you back to that road one more time. The road from the fortress of Antonia, where Jesus was probably scourged and condemned, out to the hill of Golgotha was not long. Probably about a third of a mile. Maybe half a mile at most. Today it is called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrow. Tourists walk it every day, following the 14 stations of the cross. Simon has his own station on that walk. The 5th station. Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus carry the cross. But on that original day there was no Via Dolorosa. There was no station. There was just a road, dust, sunlight, shouting, crying, sweat. The sound of hobnailed sandals on stone. The smell of the city. Simon walked that road with the cross on his shoulders. How long did he carry it? Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15, maybe half an hour. The Gospels don't say. But whatever the time was, it was enough. Enough to plant a seed, enough to change a life, enough to leave a story that would outlast every empire that was standing that day. There is a Hebrew proverb, and I want to use it here because it fits so well. The proverb says, "One moment can teach what a lifetime cannot." I cannot verify this as a specific written proverb from a specific book, so I will present it as folk wisdom that many Jewish elders have said in one form or another, and it captures something real. One moment, one act, one carrying, and Simon's whole life became different. Let me now step out and speak directly to you, the listener. We live in a world that worships the big story. We watch the news and see presidents, celebrities, billionaires, athletes. We scroll through our phones and see influencers with millions of followers. We live in a culture that says if you're not famous, you don't matter. If you're not viral, you're invisible. If your name isn't on a headline, your life isn't important. But Simon of Cyrene tells us something different. Simon of Cyrene tells us that the most important act of your life may be something you didn't plan. It may be something you were forced into. It may be something that happened on a random afternoon when you were just trying to get to your family's dinner table. And it may be an act of quiet service that nobody will remember except the people you helped, but heaven remembers. That is a phrase people of faith use. And even if you are not a person of faith, there is something to it, because history does have a memory, and the memory of history is not always fair. Sometimes it forgets the emperors and remembers the passers-by. Simon was a passer-by, and now his name is on the lips of children on every continent. Let me now bring in something practical, something a little closer to home. I want to talk about how Simon's story applies to us today, because if a story is only ancient, if it only lived 2,000 years ago and never touches our lives now, then it is just an old story. But Simon is not just an old story. Simon is a mirror. Look into that mirror. When have you carried someone else's cross? I don't mean the wooden kind. I mean the metaphorical kind. When have you helped a stranger who was collapsing under the weight of their own life? When have you sat with a friend who was falling apart and didn't know how to hold themselves up? When have you stayed on the phone with someone at 3 a.m. because they were scared? When have you paid the grocery bill for a family behind you in line? When have you lifted a burden that was not yours? Those moments, those small, unrecorded, mostly forgotten moments, those are your Simon moments. Those are the moments when you walked beside someone in their sorrow, even though you had somewhere else to be. Most of us have done this. Most of us have been Simon at some point, and most of the time, no one saw it. No one clapped. No one wrote it down, and yet, those moments are the ones that quietly hold the world together. And here is the deeper truth. Sometimes we forget that we too have been the one on the road. We have been the one collapsing. We have been the one who could not carry our own weight anymore. And someone came to us, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, maybe a total stranger, and they lifted the wood for us. They didn't fix everything. They didn't make the pain go away. But they walked beside us. They carried what we could not carry alone. If you can remember someone like that in your own life, take a moment, even just for a heartbeat, and thank them silently. They were your Simon. Now let me shift again. Let me come back to the history, because I want to make sure we don't drift too far from the facts. I want to walk with the sources. When scholars study Simon of Cyrene, they look at 3 main things: the gospel accounts, the archaeology, and the traditions of the early church. The gospel accounts we have already discussed. Mark, Matthew, Luke, all name him. John does not. But the archaeology has produced one surprising discovery. In the 1940s, a group of tombs was discovered in the Kidron Valley, just outside Jerusalem. Inside one of those tombs, archaeologists found an ossuary. An ossuary is a small stone box used in that period to hold the bones of the dead after the flesh had decayed. This particular ossuary had an inscription, and the inscription read, "Alexander, son of Simon," and here is where it gets interesting. The ossuary also had another mark, the word Cyrene. Now, some scholars have argued that this ossuary belonged to the very Alexander mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, the son of Cyrene. Others have been more cautious. They say that Simon was a common name and Alexander was a common name, and we cannot be certain. But even the cautious scholars admit that it is a remarkable find. A stone box in the outskirts of Jerusalem from roughly the right time period, bearing the exact names mentioned in the earliest gospel, connected to the same city in North Africa. It is at least a piece of physical evidence that suggests the story Mark told was based on real people who lived in real places and left behind real bones. Archaeology cannot prove faith. Archaeology cannot prove that Simon carried the cross, but archaeology can whisper to us, across 2,000 years, that these were real names, real families, real lives, and the early church traditions. Though we treat them with caution, remembered Simon in many ways. In the Coptic Church of Egypt, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and in various other traditions, Simon has been honored for centuries. Some traditions place his later life in Africa. Some say he returned to Cyrene and taught the faith there. We do not have hard proof of these traditions, but the fact that so many different communities remembered him tells us something. It tells us that Simon mattered, even after his short walk was over. Let me tell you now about one of the most famous artistic representations of Simon. If you go to museums in Europe, Paris, Rome, Madrid, London, you will find countless paintings of Jesus carrying the cross. And in many of those paintings, if you look carefully, you will see a second figure in the background, often smaller, often darker skinned, sometimes holding the end of the cross, sometimes reaching out to touch the wood. That is Simon, usually painted anonymously, sometimes barely visible, often placed at the edges of the canvas. It is almost as if the painters themselves knew what history had done. They knew that some deserved a place in the picture, but they also knew that the story was not really about him. So they put him in the corner, faithful to both the truth and the tradition. But a few artists over the centuries have done something different. They have made Simon to one the center. They have painted him full on. They have shown his face, his eyes, his expression, the weight of the wood on his shoulders. And when you see those paintings, you feel something different. You feel the humanity of the moment. You see that Jesus was not alone. You see that even in the worst hour of human history, another human being was there, bending, lifting, walking. There is a painting by a Spanish artist named El Greco from the late 1500s that shows Jesus carrying the cross. It is a beautiful, haunting image, and while El Greco does not include Simon in every version, other artists of that period made Simon a central figure. They placed him in the light. They gave him dignity. That dignity is what history often denies to helpers. We celebrate stars. We forget stagehands. We celebrate soldiers. We forget the mothers who packed their bags. We celebrate presidents. We forget the janitors who cleaned the floors of the White House at midnight. And we celebrate Jesus. We forget Simon. This is not a criticism of Jesus. This is not a criticism of religion. This is a simple observation about how the human mind works. We focus on the peak of the mountain. We forget the mountain itself, but Simon is part of the mountain. Simon is part of the story. Simon is the reminder that no story is ever really carried by one person alone. Let me now come to something a little more personal in this reflection, because I want us to move from the head to the heart. There is a certain sadness in being forgotten. We all know that. We all fear it, in some deep corner of ourselves. We work jobs where no one thanks us. We raise children who might not remember our small acts of love. We love people who leave us. We build careers that will be forgotten within a generation, and in the back of our minds we sometimes wonder, did any of it matter? Did anyone see me? Will anyone remember? Simon of Cyrene, in his own way, whispers something back to us. Simon whispers, they may not remember your name, but they will feel your carrying. Let that sit for a moment. They may not remember your name, but they will feel your carrying. Because that is the truth of Simon. We don't know if anyone in that crowd remembered him by evening. We don't know if the Roman soldiers who grabbed him ever thought about him again, but Jesus felt the lifting of the weight. Jesus felt the moment of relief. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about a man whose name almost got lost in the dust. Your name may not carry into the history books, but the good you do lands somewhere. Someone feels it. Someone remembers it, even if they never say your name out loud. Now, let me shift into something that I think is one of the most powerful lessons of Simon's story, and that is the lesson of interruption. Simon's life was interrupted. He was on his way to something, maybe a meal, maybe the temple, maybe a business meeting. We don't know, but he was going somewhere, and Roman soldiers pulled him out of his own life and forced him into someone else's story. Interruptions are hard. We plan our days, we plan our weeks, we plan our years, and then life happens, a diagnosis, a phone call, a broken car, a hurt child, an aging parent, a friend in crisis, and suddenly, we are pulled out of our own plans and forced to carry a weight we did not expect. Most of us handle interruption badly. We resent it. We complain. We ask, why me? Why now? Why this? And those are natural feelings. I am not saying they are wrong, but here is what Simon shows us. Sometimes the interruption is the meaning. Sometimes the thing that ruins your day becomes the thing that gives your life a story. If Simon had not been interrupted, If he had reached his Passover meal, if he had gone home, if he had never touched that wood, we would not know his name. His life might have been happy. It might have been long. It might have been prosperous, but it would have been forgotten. The interruption is what made him unforgettable. That is a hard lesson, and I am not saying every interruption is a blessing. Some interruptions are just tragedies. Some are just losses. Some are just cruelty. I am not going to tie a bow on every hard thing and say it is meaningful. That would be a lie. And this story is not about lies, but Simon's story does say this, that sometimes the thing you did not choose becomes the thing you were made for. Sometimes the weight on your shoulders is the weight that carries you into eternity, and that leads us to one more angle, the angle of the crowd. There was a whole crowd that day, thousands of people, all watching, all whispering, all going about their lives. Simon was one of them. Any of them could have been chosen. Any of them could have been pulled out of the line. But the soldier's hand landed on Simon, and here is the question. Why him? Maybe he looked strong. Maybe he was closest. Maybe the soldier just picked randomly. We don't know. But the moment his shoulder was tapped, everything changed. There is a lesson here about being present, being awake, being ready. Because you do not always know when your moment is going to arrive. Do not always know when the tap on the shoulder is going to come. And when it comes, you have a choice. You can resist. You can refuse. You can try to slip back into the crowd, or you can bend down and lift. Simon lifted. That is what we know. Now, I want to speak for a moment to those of you who are listening to this and feeling like your life is too small to matter. Maybe you are tired. Maybe you have been working for years at a job that no one appreciates. Maybe you are raising kids and no one sees how much you sacrifice. Maybe you are caring for a sick loved one and you feel invisible. Maybe you have been carrying a burden for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like not carry anything. I want to say this to you. I cannot promise that your name will be remembered. I cannot promise that the world will thank you. But I can promise, based on the pattern of history, based on the story of Simon, based on the way human memory has always worked, the small, quiet acts of care that fill your life are not wasted. They are not lost. They are woven into something larger than you can see from where you are standing. There is a Native American saying that I want to share carefully, because I want to respect the tradition. Many Native American elders across different nations have taught, in one form or another, that when we do good, we plant seeds for the 7th generation. We may not see the harvest. Our children may not see the harvest. But 7 generations from now, someone will eat from a tree that we planted. Simon planted a tree that day, and we, 2,000 years later, are still sitting in its shade. Let me now begin to bring this story home. Because we have walked a long road together tonight, and the sun is setting over the hills of Golgotha in our imagination. Everyone remembered Jesus. Everyone remembered the cross. Everyone remembered the resurrection. And rightly so. The story is monumental. The story has shaped continents. The story has built cathedrals and toppled empires. The story has comforted millions on their deathbeds. The story has divided families and united nations. The story is impossible to ignore. But woven into that great story is a small thread, a thread named Simon. And if you pull on that thread, you find a whole other tapestry, a tapestry of ordinary people, of interrupted afternoons, of strangers helping strangers, of names half remembered and half forgotten, of Africa touching Palestine, of one continent placing its shoulder under the pain of another, of families like Alexander and Rufus, who grew up hearing their father tell a story that must have sounded at first unbelievable. Their father, a common man, had carried the cross of the most talked about man in the Roman world. Can you imagine those family dinners? The sons growing up in Cyrene or maybe in Rome, hearing their father say, "I was there, I lifted the wood, I walked behind him," and eventually those sons became known in the church. Their mother became a mother figure to Paul the Apostle. Their family became part of the movement that would spread from Palestine to Africa to Europe to Asia to the Americas, all because their father was interrupted on his way to Passover. There is one more thing I want to say before we close, and it is this. The truth about Simon is that we do not know how the story ended for him. We do not know if he became a bishop. We do not know if he died a martyr. We do not know if he ever spoke of that day. We do not know if he was angry, or grateful, or transformed, or unchanged. History has given us his name. It has given us his sons' names. It has given us his hometown, and then it has closed the door. But sometimes, closed doors are more honest than open ones. Sometimes, silence is more truthful than speech. The Gospels resist the temptation to explain everything. They do not tell us what Simon thought. They do not tell us what he said. They let him be a mystery, and that mystery has protected his story. Because if the Gospels had turned him into a hero, we might have doubted him. If they had made him a villain, we might have hated him. If they had given him a long speech, we might have argued about the speech. Instead, they let him be silent. A walking man, a carrying man, a father from Africa, and in that silence, every one of us can find ourselves. Every one of us can imagine standing in his sandals. Every one of us can wonder what we would have done if a soldier had grabbed our shoulder on a dusty day in Jerusalem. That is the gift Simon gives us, the gift of a mirror, the gift of a space in the story that we can enter. Because the story of Jesus, as vast as it is, can sometimes feel too big, too holy, too far away. But the story of Simon is right down at street level. It is dust in the eyes. It is sweat on the neck. It is the ache of a burden you did not want. And that is a story every human being can relate to. Everyone remembered Jesus. No one really remembered Simon. And yet, when you tell his story carefully, when you slow down and look at him, when you notice that little detail odds mark at the mention of Alexander and Rufus, when you find the ossuary in the Kidron Valley, when you follow the memory of his name into Africa, into Rome, into the early church, you begin to see that he was not forgotten at all. He was hidden. He was quiet. He was tucked into the corners, but he was there. He was always there, and he still is. The next time you see a picture of the cross, look for the second figure. Look behind Jesus. Look in the shadow of the beam. Look for the man from Cyrene, and when you see him, greet him. Because he is not just a footnote of history. He is a whisper from history to every one of us who has ever felt small. The whisper says, lift the wood. Even when it is not your cross. Even when you did not choose it. Even when no one is watching. Even when your name might never be remembered. Lift the wood. Because someone, somewhere, is carrying more than they can carry. And there is always room on the road for one more shoulder. Let me leave you now with something that I hope will stay with you long after this video is done. There is a truth that the powerful of this world learned too late. That the biggest names are not always the ones that last. That the loudest voices are not always the ones that echo. That history sometimes turns her head away from the throne and looks toward the dusty road and remembers the passerby instead. Simon of Cyrene did not go looking for greatness. Greatness went looking for Simon, and when it tapped him on the shoulder, he did not run. He did not curse. He did not fight it, at least not in any way we can find in the record. He simply bent down and lifted and walked. That is what we can do too, when the tap comes to our shoulder, when the interruption arrives, when the person in front of us stumbles. We can bend, we can lift, we can walk. We may not be remembered by the world, but the person we help will feel it. And somewhere quietly, our names will be woven into a story larger than ourselves. Everyone remembered Jesus, and that is right. That is good. That is how it should be. But tonight, we also remember Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, the man from Cyrene, the passerby, the carrier, the quiet human being who did the small right thing in the middle of the biggest wrong the world had ever seen. And if his name has survived for 2,000 years, then maybe, just maybe, the good we do today will also survive, not in stone, not in books, not in headlines, but in the invisible thread that runs through every generation, the thread of ordinary people doing extraordinary things without ever knowing that they were. That is the story of Simon of Cyrene, and that, my friend, is the story of you, and me, and all of us, walking down the same dusty road, carrying whatever we are given, reaching out to whoever is in front of us, hoping that when the sun goes down on our lives, someone, somewhere, will remember that we lifted the wood. May we all be a Simon when the moment comes. May we all recognize the tap on the shoulder. May we all bend low and lift high and walk with dignity. And may our silent carrying, like his, echo across 2,000 years, because history remembers the loud, but eternity remembers the kind.